Okay, welcome everybody to this lunchtime seminar by SLU Future Food. We had one yesterday. I think some of you were here yesterday as well. As you probably know, SLU Future Food is one of 4 future platforms here at SLU. And if you want to learn more about what we do and what we can help you with, please check out our website at slu.se/futurefood. Today we co-organized this seminar with the food cooperative Ultimat here at Ultuna. So I will give them a few minutes to introduce themselves.
Thank you. So hello, my name is Ida.
And I'm Heather.
And we're from Ultuna Food Cooperative, Ultimat. And we thought we'd just tell you a little bit more about us before we get into the lecture.
So Ultimat is a platform for discussion about sustainable food consumption, how we as consumers can support and promote local producers by creating long-lasting relationships. The co-op is centered around ordering and distributing food from local producers. We also organize seminars like this and other activities such as food workshops, field trips, and other social events.
Yes, so now that you know a little bit more about us, we're excited to hear more on the topic of consumer-producer relationships from Rebecka Milestad. So thank you and enjoy the lecture.
And I forgot to say that my name is Pernilla Jonsson and I'm the program secretary of Future Food. And we also have our communicator here, Gunilla Leffler, and administrator Kristin Tored. So now I will leave the floor to Rebecka Milestad, who is an agronomist with a PhD in rural development from SLU, but now works or has the position as associate professor at the Royal Institute of Technology in environmental strategies research. And she will give a presentation on the emerging food landscape, local, relational, scalable.
Thanks. Question mark. Yeah, so it's nice to see you. So many people refraining from the nice weather outside. I'm honored to have you here and to be here again. It was some time ago that I was at SLU. So as Pernilla said, I've been a student here and I made my PhD here. And I worked here as a researcher for some years, and now I'm at KHH in Stockholm. And I'm still working in the same fields of alternative food networks, consumer-producer relationship, urban-rural linkages, and so on. So I will try to tell you a little bit about that today and focus on some parts of this, the things that might emerge, like local relational food systems. How are they? How do they work? What are they? And can we scale them up? That's the question. So I'd like to fit all of this into today. So I will start with a very brief background because I think most of you know a lot of, we're here at SLU. But I will say a few words about the current dominant food system because it's important when we try to understand why this new emerging alternative food networks have emerged. And then I will go on to try to talk a little bit more about what local food systems can be and how they are described. So I'll focus on that. And then a few words about sustainability issues in relation to local food systems. And then I'll try to give you some examples on different scales and also finish off by discussing the potential for scaling up. So can they be sort of grow out of a niche or can they be more than just small dispersed examples out there? And the idea is to talk now and then if we have time in the end, I'm very happy if you have questions. I'll do this in English. I think it will be fine. So, what does the dominant food system look like where we get most of our food today in our part of the world? Well, it's can be described in many ways, but one way to describe it is with these words or these trends, you can say, and they are interlinked and they depend on each other and they overlap. And it's very sketchy now because I need to do this fast. So one trend we can see is this intensification of land use. So we use each patch of land that we have in industrial agriculture much more intensively than we did 70 years ago. So that means we have irrigation, we have high-yielding crops, varieties, and high-yielding breeds. We have machinery, we use fossil fuels to run our machines and to produce artificial fertilizers. So we use a lot more energy and a lot more resources to grow food on patches of land that we have. The result is that we get a lot more harvest, so the yields have increased manifold during this time. But we also run into some problems. Using fossil fuels emit greenhouse gases, for example. Nutrients or pesticides might end up in the wrong place, and so on. And we also have structural and social change in agricultural areas. Very tightly connected to this is this trend of specialization, which means that if everyone does what they're best at, in economic terms, that's more efficient. So you get large monocultures of crops over here and large monocultures of animals over here. But the crops are grown to a large extent to feed the animals over here. And the nutrients in the manure from the animals are needed for the crop production over there. But because they are separated in space, it's very hard to get this circularity going. So you get a nutrient or like a waste problem where the animals are in the nutrients, and you get a lack of nutrients where the crops are, so you need artificial fertilizers. And in these linear systems, you get a lot of leakage, so nutrients run off to the groundwater or emit as greenhouse gases, which creates problems. And another problem is that in large monocultures, they are very vulnerable to pests or diseases, both in animals and crops. So we need chemicals. So that's the third trend here that I've put up. So it's chemicalization, medicines and pesticides, for example, so to secure our harvests, because it's they're very vulnerable because you have one of the same for large areas or a lot of animals in the same space. So we need antibiotics, which creates problems with resistance, and we get pesticides, which might create problems when we kill off other insects or plants that we actually need, for example, bees. And the fourth trend is the distance trend. It's both concrete and in our heads. So, because fossil fuels have been cheap the last 70 years, we can afford to ship and transport food all over the globe. So food is a commodity. And when doing transports, obviously we need fossil fuels, and with these problems they have with emitting greenhouse gases, for example. But there's also a psychological or cognitive distance that we have. When I go into the shop to shop my food, which is where most of us go to shop our food in our part of the world, the bulk, it's very hard for me as a consumer to know or judge or realize the outcomes of my food choices in terms of how in the environment or animals or people do where these points of production, because it's far away. And it's also very hard to know if they've been produced the way I think they might have been produced, and to control that. And the last two examples of the trends is this concentration of actors in the food system. It starts from the farm level, where we have fewer and larger farms, generally, as a general trend. But we also have fewer and larger companies involved in the whole input industry or the processing or the retailing industry in the food system on a global level. So even if we go into the shop and we find a lot of brands and we have a whole range of things to choose from when we go shop our food, which is ever increasing. The actors and the companies behind these brands or these products are fewer and fewer, which also is a matter of power issues and so concerned with. And it's very linked to this homogeneity or like one way of how food cultures develop and how food, the taste of what food we want is sort of getting narrower and narrower when we have lost a large part of biodiversity and genetic diversity in crops and so on. So this is sort of the background, and what we can call then alternative food systems or alternative food networks is there are people, consumers, producers, others, activists, who think that these problems are large and they have to be dealt with. They want to give consumers and producers more power again, to give farmers more money and economic power in the food system, and to bypass these large structures and find new ways. And that's why it has emerged in our time, so to speak. So we need to know that, because otherwise it's hard to understand why it's there. And then the question is, we get a lot of food out of this system, and it's very successful in these terms. But there's a lot of things we want from the food system that we don't get. So, and what are these things? Well, here are some of them. Well, we want environmentally friendly production. We don't want to produce our food at the expense of future generations, for example, or other species or animals. We want animals to do well in our system. There's a lot of question marks about that at the moment. We want social justice. We want fair trade. We want people to be treated well in food systems. For example, we want good economic terms for farmers. We want jobs in rural areas and on farms, green jobs. We want nutritious food, not empty food. We want open landscapes, especially here in our forested country, where we cherish, for aesthetic reasons, the open landscapes. And open landscapes are also very much high. They're high in biodiversity, at least some of them. So this is sort of what we lack parts of, and why also this movement or these emerging food systems emerge. And then the question is, how do we get it? How are we supposed to get all of these things? And as consumers, we're told a lot of different messages. We're giving a lot of information. We're told to buy organic food. We are told to eat according to the season. That's supposed to be good. We're told to eat less meat, and then we discuss what kind of meat. We are told to waste less food, and we're told to eat local food. And I could go into these things, and we can stay there and talk about that for this rest of the lecture, but I will not. So I will focus on local food, because I think that's very interesting in the sense because there's no definition, and still we use it all the time. As if you compare to organic, for example, we can discuss that a lot too, but at least there's a definition. We can decide what we're talking about. But in terms of local food, there's no definition, so I would like to go into that and sort of show you, hopefully, the complexity, and maybe give you some answers, and maybe leave you confused afterwards. But that's also a point, because then you might be more careful when you talk about it after today, maybe. So what about local food? What are the words we use? What do we mean? Well, when you read the literature, like the academic literature about local food or similar, there's a lot of different concepts that come out. Distance is very important. Well, that might be intuitive. Region, food from specific regions, it's very common also. But also personal relationships, like closeness in a more psychological way or between people. In Swedish we say often närodlat or härodlat, but we never specify how what när is, where it stops and where it ends, where it starts. There's also often mention of alternative, because there's some kind of umbrella concept. Alternative food is everything that's not the dominant food system, but it's very also undefined where it starts and where it ends. Some talk about local identity, so connecting food to identities and local to that. And relocalization of food systems, like with the idea then that they used to be local food systems, now they're not local, and we need to relocalize them again, whatever that means. So these are words that sort of appear. So if you, in another way, you can say that local food can be from a specific village or a region or a country even, that it's named, or it can be from a place with a certain distance to where you buy it. So it's more like the distance, not the place itself. Or it can be from a person you know and trust, wherever that person is. So describing local food, it can be all of these three things, or it can be one of them or two of them. So before I try to offer you some kind of definition, which is not a very solid definition, I would like to make one more sort of distinction between regional specialities and localized food production. So in terms of regional specialities, the European Union has defined what it thinks can be branded as a regional speciality. And these three brands were the different levels of sort of regionality. The first, the red one, is sort of most tightly known because it's all the processing and production has been made in a region. For example, Parmesan cheese has this labeling. And the weakest one is like a traditional recipe from a different region with some identity, but it can be produced somewhere else. Falukorv, for example, has this labeling. So these are products with a regional sort of identity, and they might be produced in a specific region, but they can be sold wherever. So I would like to suggest that this is not what we're talking about when we talk about local food systems. So I would rather say that we talk about local food system when we say that these are products that have been produced and processed and distributed and consumed within a certain area. And then we can discuss where this area is. But this is what I will going to talk about in the rest of this time we spent together. Are you following me? Yes. So, some sustainability issues in connection to local food systems. And there's a fairly large literature. I would say most of it is concentrated on social issues, but I'll try to give you some examples of everything. And a few examples, not all examples. There's a lot to say about this. I will say a few things. So, starting with environmental issues. One argument that is often made from like activists or people who want to support local food is that it uses less energy because it uses less transports. And this is a critical issue because, and using less energy is good because if we use less fossil fuels, we emit less greenhouse gases. This is where we want to get to. And it's true that local food system normally uses less transport, so at least there's fewer food miles, because obviously if you keep within a region, you're not going further away than this region, even if you might go many ways, and even if you might have smaller trucks and less efficient transport maybe than in a larger system. But the main issue here, I would say, is that to remember that most of the energy use in a food item's life is not in the transport system, but in the primary production phase. So, and it depends then on the production system more than on the transports, how much energy a tomato or a piece of meat entails. So while transport is important, it's more important to think about the production system in terms of energy use. So that's a point I wanted to make. And then another argument for local food systems are that they create more biodiversity, partly because the argument is that if you have local food systems, you have shorter distance to your consumers, You don't have to storage or make the products don't have to endure long transport, so you can produce more different types of fruits or vegetables, for example, that would normally not be found in a large-scale market because they were too perishable. So more varieties, more biodiversity. And there are examples of that. And I want to mention one small study we made here at SLU a few years ago about on-farm biodiversity and how that connected to the market channel. So we selected farmers who were selling locally and tried to see if that impacted the on-farm biodiversity. And we had two examples. One was grass-fed beef production, and the other one was vegetables. And it's a qualitative study, so it's just like indications. But when we looked at the meat production, this meat was then produced on semi-natural grasslands, which are high in biodiversity in Sweden. It's a biotope that's high in biodiversity. But it's also a production system that is fairly high work intensive for the farmer, and it's extensive, so it's more expensive. So the meat, to make sense, the meat has to be more expensive than other meat. And to be able to communicate this, we saw then that the selling directly to consumers, like being able to explain this, arguing for this price, made this production system possible for these particular farmers at least. If you would find them in the shelf in the supermarket, the consumer is left to make this decision him or herself, but standing on the market and arguing for that, it's easier for a consumer to make that decision when you're sort of pressured by the farmer. So this then was possible, this type of production system was possible for these farmers because they were selling locally. And in the other example on biodiversity with vegetables, these were then vegetable farmers who sold directly to their consumers on markets. They specialized in diversity, you can say, that they wanted to offer a wide range to satisfy consumer demand. And it was not only a lot of different crops, but it was also a lot of different varieties within each crop category. For example, not one type of tomato, but 10 maybe. So in that sense, this planned biodiversity on farm was also helped because they were selling locally and could sort of discuss that with and fill up the consumers' demands in that sense. So back to sustainability issues and on economic issues, there are two arguments that are often made that local food systems are good to create local jobs and that incomes for farmers are improved. And well, obviously, if you keep all the processing and the distribution and production within a region and selling, the jobs connected to this production and processing and distribution will stay in this region. So yes, and farmers who do a lot more of the work, they don't only do the growing, but they do the selling and maybe the distribution itself, they can capture a larger part of that, the food costs themselves. I'll come back to that because obviously it involves more work also. And as I said before, a larger part, I think, of the literature discussing sustainability issues in terms of local food is on the social part. For example, that transparency is, it's helpful to put more transparency in the food system if farmers and consumers can meet and you can ask questions, you can develop knowledge, you can learn, and so on. And this is very tightly connected to trust, that you build trust when you meet someone. And trust is a very interesting issue, I think, because it seems from many studies that trust is not produced because you meet first time, but trust is produced first, and then you go to the market because you trust people selling at the market. And then at the marketplace, maybe if you meet producers, this trust is built on and it's sort of stabilized. But it's also the case that trust can stand in the way for asking critical questions. If you trust someone so much, you have maybe a picture in your head on what's happening on the farm that you might not really, that's not true. We have some examples of that, but I won't go into that. So that's interesting. And then a general sense of community and cultural identity is also, there's studies about showing that this is builds up when you have a more like localized food circuits where you can meet and discuss and talk about the food. And then social justice in general, which is a huge concept, but in this case then it maybe concerns community power or power in general, economic power to farmers again, and fairer trade relations and so on. And last point about sustainability issues from the literature, well-being issues, 2 examples that products are fresher, and that's a good thing than from in local food systems. Well, we mainly talk about vegetables and fruits then, because other unseasonal products, they are fresh. Well, it depends how you process them and how you... But vegetables, which is sort of the picture we get maybe from farmers' markets also, if you pick it in the morning and sell it in the afternoon, obviously it's going to be fresher than if you pick it in the morning, put it in the storage, put it on a lorry that goes across the country and then goes into the retailer and the supermarket. So there are examples of that. And then it's a work satisfaction. There's quite a few studies how farmers, why they're motivated to take part in these systems. And one reason is that they think that it's more worthwhile to be a farmer because they like the feedback they get from the consumers. And this was one thing that was confirmed in a study we made also on farmers' markets a few years ago, why farmers and consumers take part in these markets where you can interact with the other part. And the top sort of reason for both groups was to meet the other group, so meet them face to face, which was very important. And for farmers, it was then to get the feedback from consumers. One farmer described it as, I grow an inch every time I get some, positive feedback, and it makes it all worthwhile. And also to meet other farmers, and the consumers thought that the market experience was fun and nice, and consumers wanted to buy these products which they perceived then as fresh and genuine and tasty and safe and high quality and everything. And the farmers wanted to offer these products. They were proud of their products. And from the consumer part also, they went to the market because they had a pre-understanding then. They trusted the farmers more than the supermarket. They wanted to support these farmers that they perceived them as local or small scale or environmentally friendly or high in animal welfare. It was a preconception, and they wanted to buy this food. And from the farmers, they thought that they got a higher price per product for their food at the market because they could sort of bypass all other structures. And they also had this control of the whole value chain. They could see who was eating their pumpkins. So when they were sowing their pumpkins next time, they could have this picture in the head of the people who normally buys it and sort of adjust maybe a variety or I need to plant this variety because this old woman likes it so much, and so on. But as I might have hinted already, there are a few critical issues too concerning sustainability issues and local food systems. And here are a few. I will go into 2 of them a little bit more. So, as I already said, so the question is how close is local? There's no consensus and there's no sort of, it can't be either because it depends on the food item and where you are in the world, obviously. And there's also a limit to where it stops and ends to make sense to talk about the local. What's the orange in Sweden? It's you can say it's more local to buy a Spanish orange than a South American orange, but it really doesn't really make sense in the way we talk about local food systems. So geography is important, and you might have to discuss it for each and every time that you start a new discussion, so to speak. And then it's this hybridity. It's not either or. It's not that we have the global industrialized large-scale system over here, and it's the small-scale alternative local food system over here, and farmers, wake up in the morning and say, today and the rest of my life I will go to this way or that way. Farmers produce, and they produce for a market, and they take part in both markets, depending on the products they have and depending on the size of the farms and how they produce. So they can take part in both systems, and I will come back to that when we talk about scale issues. So they also sort of somehow support each other, maybe, because you might need the structures in the large-scale system to cope in the local food system. So it's both. And then it's a workload issue. If a farmer produces food and then ships it off to the retailer, or if a farmer produces food and cleans it and packages and box it or distribute it and sell it, it's a whole, you capture more money, but you also do a lot of more work, which might create jobs, obviously, but not always. So it's not seldomly a matter of self-exploitation and a very high workload, and not for everyone to be able to take part in these systems. So that's a very critical issue, also in connection to consumers then, who tend to be maybe more well-educated and well-off than farmers are in these systems. And then it's about vulnerability. So how much local is enough or is good? And I'll try to show you this picture. So if you, on the one axis, you see self-reliance, which then is a high level of localness. So like you have a local food system. On the other one, it's a high, like a level of global dependence, or like imports. And there are different vulnerabilities in both these systems. So if we're dependent on imports, which we are right now, we're also vulnerable to global disturbance. For example, a geopolitical crisis or a fossil fuel shortage or something happening in other parts of the world that influences if we can do our imports or not. On the other hand, if we sort of say, okay, no more imports, we want to go local, we are vulnerable to local disturbance, for example, a drought or a flooding or a pest outbreak or something else. So the question is where we find a good balance. Maybe it's in the middle or something close to the middle. That's a question mark, but it's something we need to consider. And the last thing I wanted to say about these issues is the local trap, is where we mix up things. I'll show you a picture about that too. It's very often, or like somehow implied, both in academic literature and also in the sort of debate in the society, that local means a lot of other things than that I would say they don't. That it's automatically small scale, nice for the animals, good for the people, good for the nature and everything. But I would like to make distinctions. So I would say that, and a lot of other authors too, and not just me, that local is a geographical way of thinking, and it's about distance and it's about relationships maybe, and then environmentally friendly or environmental issues, production systems or whatever, it's something else. And also socially just is something third. So they can converge, like in the green area in the middle, which might be where most people would like to find themselves, but they don't have to. So every time we talk about local, we should take care to say what we mean. And not take things for granted. Okay, so now I would leave the sustainability issues and go on to give you some examples on different scales of local food systems. Because even if we have a definition, it's still a lot of different things it can be. For example, on the sort of the most intimate level, which I've been talking about already, this face-to-face, where face-to-face interaction happens. For example, a farmer's market, where there's no middleman, where the farmers meet the consumers directly. The marketplace sort of defines the whole interaction. And in the Swedish case, with the farmer's own market, there's a sort of limit to how far you can go to the market to sell your food. So that's sort of the definition of local then. But there's no definition of production system, for example. And when they meet at the market, producers and consumers have this understanding somehow. They acknowledge each other. And there's a potential for learning. So there's a potential for me as a consumer to ask about production or whatever, which I can take this opportunity or I don't. So that's why I say potential. So moving up, this is a sort of a one-to-one sort of relationship, but it's only on the market. But moving up in scale and in a different kind of relationship is what we can call community-supported agriculture. In Sweden, we now say andelsjordbruk. So that's where consumers share the risk with the farmer for production. And you can buy, prepay for a subscription of a box or part of the harvest. So if you prepay it, you also get a part of the harvest, but you don't know beforehand how much that will be. And it can be home delivered, or you can pick it up. And it might also include that you as a consumer go to the farm and help out somehow. And it also includes, nowadays in Sweden's public procurement, as there are a number of municipalities who buy shares in farms like this. So that's a very, I would say, a growing trend right now. And then moving up this scale again is where you use intermediaries to sort of get things going. This is one example are then box schemes. And this is an example from Ekolådan. And you don't have to see it, I don't think you will do, but it's sort of an illustration of Ekolådan is the green spot in the middle, and they buy them from Swedish farmers and from farmers outside of Sweden in Europe and in worldwide. They buy processed or dried food, and they buy bread, for example, collected everything where they are in a storage house, and then repackage it in boxes, and they deliver it to the consumers. So as an intermediary then, Ekolådan has control over the whole value chain, but it sits in the middle. So the consumers and the farmers don't meet, but the consumers get information about the farmers because you can read about them on the homepage. You get always a list of where each tomato comes from, or the broccoli or whatever. And the sort of unique selling point, or the sort of the reason why you would buy this, is that you get it home delivered. It's convenient. And you get quality organic food with a face, so to speak. And this is sort of one type of food hub, which is, there's many types of food hubs or food nodes, or you can call it different ways, to sort of get things going and give it a possibility to scale up. And I will come back to that. And in this case, and in other cases, it's very important to use internet and social media, because otherwise they wouldn't have emerged in the way they have done, I would say. These are two examples, Gårdsnära, where you find local farm shops in the internet on the homepage, or Min Farm, where you can buy food basket via the homepage, or Ekolådan or other box schemes where you use the internet page as a shop window or whatever, or to interact and get information. But it can also be used to actually connect, to get interaction, which is virtual. And there are studies about that too. And it's helpful if you have met once and then you go on to meet on Facebook, whatever. But it also creates a fairly high level of sort of feeling of reconnection, even if you haven't met, and you use social media for interaction, asking questions, giving information, and so on. Rekoringar in Sweden, for example, is via Facebook, I think. So internet is very important in the scaling part, and I will now want to continue to talk about scaling up. I'll give you two examples in two studies. One was about the box scheme. So we looked at in Austria, outside Vienna, and it was about how this box scheme had grown over the last 10 years and tried to scale up. And this box scheme was based on a farm. So it was a farm producing vegetables mainly. They had a farm shop. They took part in farmers' markets in the city. But the bulk of the income was from, I think, over 7,000 boxes of vegetables and other food that was home delivered to consumers in the area, mainly Vienna then. They try to combine all these aspects, like they wanted to be local or regional at least. They had everything was supposed to be organic, so they wanted to be environmentally friendly, and they had a lot of things going on to sort of be socially engaged in different ways, trying to employ people that would otherwise not be employed and so on. And when they grew, a lot of challenges turned up, obviously, and that's what we wanted to look at. And one important issue with this was that in their rhetoric, they said that we want to support regional farmers. They are our suppliers, so they had over 100 suppliers supplying these boxes. So they had to have this relationship with the over 100 farmers in the region to get the tomatoes and the mushrooms or whatever. So that was also part of their marketing and sort of their core value, that this box scheme was the intermediary for farmers in the region who wanted to go local but not do everything themselves. So some issues that emerged in this research was that farmers choose to take part in this because they didn't want to have anything to do with retail. Many of them, they had bad experience of pressing price and so on. But they also didn't want to take part in direct marketing. Some did, but it was convenient for them just to give it to this intermediary instead. So the box scheme was sort of the scaling up opportunity. And the farmers felt that they had sort of enough contact with consumers because their identity followed the product in the box, because there was this newsletter about where the carrots were from and so on. But there was a very obvious tension then because in this growing phase where logistics and distribution and control by this box scheme, they thought it was necessary they had to develop the distribution and logistics. There was a tension between that and this keeping up the relationship with all these supplying farmers. And it was hard work, and they didn't succeed, I would say. So the growth was actually more due to a strategic alliance they built with 2 other box schemes, which were similar in other regions, where they could exchange like carrots for beets or whatever. So they had a lot of synergies going between them, and not because of all these supplying other regional farmers. And they had a lot of interaction with consumers, not all 7,000 of them, but with at markets or farm days or in the farm shops. So they had sort of a system for that with newsletters and chats and stuff, but they didn't have interaction with their supplying farmers. So that was a source of concern and discontent from these farmers. They felt overrun. So the challenge then was to grow while interacting with all these suppliers, and to build internal governance structures that was, helpful for this fast-growing phase, to cope with everything. So it's not. It wasn't without problems that they could grow and scale up the system they wanted to have. And the last study I want to mention today is another study where we looked at around 20 European examples of similar schemes or initiatives, but a wider range in 10 different European countries. And the idea was to look at also this, how to scale up something that's value-driven. And many of these examples then had this localness. They wanted to be local somehow, and they were organic. So they wanted to have this value, high-quality food, and they grew. So we chose them because they had been growing in their different contexts. But it was a mixture of box schemes, of organic special retailers, or processors, producer cooperatives or consumer cooperatives, or producer-consumer cooperatives. So it was all kinds of, or processors, or all different. They could be in different places in the value chain, but they were all growing, and they were all, not all were local, but the ones that were local, that's what I'm talking about. Many of them had localness as a value they wanted to sort of bring on the market. And to be able to grow successfully then, not going bankrupt, and on the one hand, but keeping your values in the whole chain and growing, there's a lot of challenges occur, and as for any type of business that grows. So it's not specific, I would say, to these, but it's might be more general. But what we found, and what mainly 3 different issues that were important to sort of think about when they were growing successfully then. And one thing that they did, those who were successful, that they focused a lot on partnerships. So building partnerships with other actors in the value chain was important, and sort of building trust and long-term thinking, so focusing more on that than to get the best price or the partner who could sort of do more profit for you, but a partner that would keep with you and stay with you and sort of share your values. And that was done in different ways. One example, for example, was a French organic retail chain called Biocoop, where shop owners and producers and consumers who were members, it was a producer-consumer cooperative, took part in discussions. How do we define local? How much local food should we have in our stores? How does it have to be? So they have a lot of value-driven discussions to sort of get things the way they wanted. And this was also a matter of success. And the second thing was to help learn. So if you grow as a company, you need to learn new things all the time. If you start as a farmer, you might be a very idealistic miller or whoever. If your company grows, you need to have marketing, you need to have accounting, you need to have more professions in your company to be able to grow. That goes for everything that's growing on the market. So professionalization was important, but in many of these examples, professionalization was not always seen as something positive. So it's hard to be sort of go from being idealistic environmental hero to a business manager. So you have to change identities a little bit, and you have to. It's a challenge. But those who could, they were successful. And then also to make learning a part of the organizational structure, not only learning occasionally from mistakes, but actually integrating learning into your organization. For example, by meeting your consumers in different way, so organizing meeting places, if it was fairs or events or whatever, or different types of interaction over the internet or in real life, so to speak, both. So when they were able to learn from their mistakes, they were strengthened to meet the future, so to speak. And then diversity. So that using diversity as a strategy was important to be successful. For example, using a lot of different actors and the knowledge of different actors in decision making. There were a German regional organic retailer that used they had a normal boss or like a business manager or two actually, but they also had an advisory group made up of consumers and producers and others who were giving advice and helping with their experience and background to make decisions more robust. And also diversity in terms of market channels, obviously. If you're dependent on one market, you're more vulnerable than if you have more possibilities. And the same goes for different products or production lines, or if you can stand on more than one leg. But many of these initiatives were large enough to have volumes that were not always possible to sell in different, what we call them, markets or own outlets. So they did cooperate with conventional retail. And that's because the good thing about conventional retail is that they can move a large volume and they can sort of distribute it and they can sell it. And that's very attractive. For example, if you know about Upplandsbondens, they have a brand, but they sell most of their meat in retailers, as Änglamark, for example. But working with retailers is not easy. They might want to have a very low price, so they can dictate the conditions if you don't take care. And they might be run by a different business logic than your idealistic company does. So we identified 4 ways of working with conventional retail where it works, where these locally oriented initiatives did well. And one was when they actually were able to share values with the retailer, where there were common denominators, so to speak, or actors at least in the retailer, like the purchaser, that they could find some common ground. And where personal relationships between key people in this interaction then was more important, and where trust building was more important than the actual price negotiation. So you might not get the best price or the lowest price compared, depending who you were, but you had this long-term thinking, you were partners rather than a negotiator. And obviously, if the initiative or the processor or whoever was not dependent on a specific retailer only for the market appearance, it's easier to say no and to negotiate a good price. So if you have many market channels, if you're a hybrid of many things, it's easier for you to get a better price. But also if you're not exchangeable, if you have a brand that the consumers will want to buy, so that the retailer can't exchange your meat for another meat item, but they want your meat, you're more sort of standing on a more equal standing with a retailer. And this was done different ways. There were some examples where a retailer and a producer cooperative develop brands together, so like exclusive rights, or where a producer cooperative develop a brand to sell in other markets, but use the brand of the retailer to sell in the retailer. So there were different ways to do that. Finishing off with some conclusions, if you agree to them. I don't know. But this local food landscape is not dominant in any way, but we talk about it more, and it's part of it. It's part of what we see emerging right now, and it's interesting to follow, I would say. And I would also say that relations between consumers and producers are an important part of local food systems, and why they might be interesting, and why people engage in them. And they are scalable under certain circumstances, but there's a lot of things to think about, and there are a lot of challenges. And we shouldn't fall into the local trap. That's very important, and we always have to know what we're talking about. And finish. Thank you for listening.